The words they're using are like 1,400 years old.
Mm-hmm.
What we did, our version of this song, that recording, this production, that is the apotheosis of our project. That's so much of what we're trying to do in terms of combining and connecting these elements and twisting it together as a sailor twists rope to create something stronger and more usable and something different, but it's still made up of all the same things.
Yeah.
But it's
functional.
It's functional, yeah. Fancy meeting you here.
Welcome. Welcome to Finding Folklore Deep Dive of Sheaf And Shield.
Episode 3, the third deep dive for the third episode. If you've just joined us, if you don't know what this weird video is,
Stumbled across it.
Yeah, which is, I mean, hopefully you have. Hopefully the algorithm is serving us. You will probably want to find episode 3 of our podcast, Finding Folklore, and listen to that, in which we tell the story of Sheaf and Shield and do a sort of an introductory discussion about the history, heritage, and cultural elements behind and around it.
But that should be available on any podcast
any
app,
and all.
hopefully also on YouTube now.
Yes, so you should also be able to check out
there should be a link on this video.
Our account, and you should be able to find it there. Also, if you really enjoy this and that, then check out the previous 2 episodes, which also have accompanying deep dive videos like this. Essentially, for each one of the podcast episodes we do, we release a long-form discussion where we get really into the nitty-gritty of it without worrying about all the casual listeners. This is for the hardcore devotees like yourselves, hopefully.
Great.
Algorithm work.
So is there any more introduction we want to do?
I feel like that's all. I mean, so
dive straight into talking
there's
about...
There's lots of dense stuff to talk about here. So I reckon let's leap right in.
Assuming that everyone's au courant with the story and everything. So of Sheaf and Shield, we're talking about this Anglo-Saxon myth.
Yeah. A version of this, by the way, features in Anglo-Saxon myths, The Struggle of the Seven Kingdoms by Brice Stratford. As you can see, it's
show it to your camera.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful hardback. Makes a perfect Christmas present. Lovely illustrations by Jesus Sotes.
Oh, it's inscribed.
That's
to
an
me,
inscribed version. If you buy it directly from us, then I will sign it for you. There's nice illustrations. I got lovely illustrations. So do get a copy, and you can read about the very thing we're discussing.
And as we mentioned in the podcast, this story is, it's very old and it's been kind of developing over centuries, certainly millennia.
It is millennia. Yeah, it is millennia. So
wow. That's an old story.
That's a spicy meatball. So I think that's a good as. We'll start at the beginning. We as we discussed in the podcast, the earliest reference we've got to Scaefa. And as I said in the podcast, we're calling them Scaefa and Scyld rather than Sciafa or Scef or Sceafa and Shield or Schuld, simply in order to more easily distinguish between the characters and a sheaf of wheat corn or a literal shield, which is what those words mean. So Widsith is the earliest reference we've got. Well, that's an Old English poem. I mean, I spoke about this, didn't I?
Yeah. Can you remind me a little bit about Widsith?
Widsith is one of the oldest of the Old English poems that survives.
What does the title refer to? Is that a name or?
Widsith is the name of the storyteller.
Oh right. Okay.
Who is reading, and essentially it's a collection of thulas, which are sort of like verses, each of which lists certain ancient kings or heroes.
Okay.
And amongst those, there is Scaefa, who is mentioned as king of the Lombards. And interestingly, he is mentioned in isolation, not without shield. The next reference we've got comes in Beowulf, which hopefully everyone who is watching is familiar with to some degree. I'm not going to give you I'm not going to go into Beowulf. That's at least one other video. But the version of Beowulf I'm looking at is the recent Tom Shippey translation. It's very good.
How do you like it? Yeah.
I do like it. Yeah, I do like it. I think it's a good, it's a solid translation, and I think it's one of the best ones available. It doesn't look to invert or challenge anything. It just seeks to provide a really good one.
A good translation of the text.
Yeah.
Now, I'm familiar with Tom Shippey because you got me to read The Road to Middle-earth.
Yes. The Road to Middle-earth.
Which I enjoyed very much.
Is there a copy of that somewhere?
There is. I think it's over there somewhere.
Oh, you fool. Sorry, Tom. It's a brilliant book, by the way. Road to Middle-earth, and it's essentially about, on the face of it, it's about how Tolkien created his cosmology. But it's about so much more than that, about the very nature, the essence of philology as a field. Oh, it's a brilliant book. I couldn't recommend it enough. You would be amazed at how relevant it is.
It's quite funny, like to outsiders, when I'm reading this book called The Road to Middle-earth, it looks like I'm reading a book about Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, in a really narrow way, but it's not.
It's
about
not.
That.
It's about everything.
Expensive.
It's
phenomenal. Good. Oh yeah, and so Tom Shippey, who is a great Anglo-Saxon scholar, has recently started to set up a publishing company, Uppsala Books. I think, yes, Uppsala Books. There they are. And this is one of their many lovely offerings, his own translation of Beowulf. So until my translation of Beowulf comes out, this'll do.
That's the best one.
Yeah. Mine will be a poetic translation and will take many, many years, I'm sure. So while we're on Beowulf, let's talk about the nature of Scaefa and Scyld as separate or combined characters, because this is something that we touched on in the episode, but which I think requires a bit more development. This is a really ancient story. Widsith dates to, some people date it as late as the late 6th century, so the 500s. So
that's late dating for Widsith.
Oh, no, that's early dating.
Okay, that's early dating.
That's early dating for Widsith. But some people date it to around 700. That's probably the latest.
Okay. Yeah.
But it could be as recent. It could be within. It could date to within living memory of Anglo-Saxon settlement in England.
Right.
Potentially, and even if it doesn't, it's still within a century or so of that. That shows how early this myth of Sceaf and Scyld, of Sheaf and Shield, is. And interestingly, that is the earliest. The genesis of this myth in the English context is distinct from the genesis of this myth in continental or in Scandinavian contexts. Really, there are three key routes by which this myth survives. There's the English, the Icelandic, and the Danish. Each of these three versions has three very different characters to it, and interestingly, it's only in the English tradition that Sheaf or Scaefa is the main character, the focus. In both the Icelandic and the Danish, Shield or Scyld is the central figure, and whilst in the Icelandic he is clearly a god. Who oddly ends up really apart on these king lists, kind of being both born of Woden and descended, and being an ancestor of Woden, weirdly. And it all gets very confusing and mixed up. But in this context, Scyld has a brother who is his Scyld is the king of Denmark, and his brother is the king of Sweden. And it says who he married. It gives it far more, roots it down into a real specific historical place. And this goes even further in the Danish sources, where he's very much treated not as a god, but as a human explicitly, as a mortal, and is treated as this great, a truly legendary, marvelous king, but a human king. And in both of those Scandinavian traditions, the focus is on the events of his life, rather than in the English tradition, where it's more about this beginning and end.
Yeah.
And it's more about this notion of cycles, and his place between Scaefa and Beowa is kind of key, right? So
is the English tradition more sort of symbolic and...
yes, it is. Yeah. It's almost more esoteric. Now, in Beowulf, in the Beowulf version, and in fact... Yeah, I'll read you Tom Shippey's translation of the Scyld Sceafing or the Shield Sheffing section. It's only 52 lines.
Okay.
Well, we've heard of the power of the Spear-Dane kings, how in days gone by they did great deeds. Shield with the sheaf, he often stripped away the mead benches from many tribes. From hosts of enemies struck fear into the heralds, since he was first picked up, a naked foundling. He got comfort for that, throve beneath the sky, gained prestige, grew in reputation, until all the peoples round about him, across the sea roads, had to obey him, give him tribute. He was a good king. To him in time a child was born, a young one for his home, sent by God as relief for his people. God saw the dire need they had endured so long without a king. So the Lord of life, the ruler of glory, granted them to have success in this world. Shield's son, Barley, became famous. His reputation spread wide in the lands of the north. That's how a young man should make a good start, by giving splendid gifts while his father is alive, so that when he's older and war comes on him, he has willing companions there to support him, stand by their prince. Among people everywhere, generous deeds will get a man on. At his appointed time, Shield passed on, a very old man, into the Lord's keeping. As he had ordered while he held rule, his loyal companions carried him to the shore. The friend of the Shieldings, beloved liege of the land, had long owned a vessel fit for a prince. The ring-proud ship stood ice-rimed in the harbour, ready to sail. They placed their dear lord, famous ring divider, in the hull of the ship, beside the mast. Many treasures and valuables from far-off lands were laid down there. I have heard of no ship more splendidly loaded with battle dress and weapons of war, with swords and armour. Many precious things lay on his breast, to go far with him into the power of the sea. They certainly did not provide him with fewer offerings from the nation's wealth than those ones did who first sent him out in the beginning, just an infant, alone over the waves. And then they raised a golden ensign, high over his head, let the waves take him, gave him to the ocean. Their minds were sad, they mourned in their hearts. No one can save ashore, not counsellors in hall, not heroes under the sky, who would receive that cargo. Then Barley, son of Shield, ruled the homesteads once his father had passed away from the world. He was a popular king, dear to his people. Okay, cool. So that's that.
That's lovely.
It is nice, isn't it?
Really
it is
good.
nice. Personally, I don't like the. This is controversial stuff,
Okay.
Jim. But I don't like the Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
Not a fan. I don't think it's. I think it's an appropriation.
Yeah.
Rather, I don't think what he does with it is what is. About excavating the text or engaging with what Beowulf is or the beauty and art of Beowulf
More about
itself.
kind of owning it. He puts it in his own sort of
He
dialect.
explicitly puts it in an Irish dialect in places, and
that's quite confusing in historical
certainly
terms.
very confusing. And I think he fixes it too much. He appropriates it. He makes his thing rather than I think it's more about Seamus Heaney and less about Beowulf. Which is why you all have to wait for my poetic translation, which will be the superior. But that's
Brice Stratford, better than Heaney.
Better than Heaney. Better than Beowulf.
But so in that, what I noticed particularly was that he mentioned the events that you associated with Scaefa as occurring to Scyld.
Scyld, yeah. In the Beowulf tradition, he ends up. In Beowulf specifically, Shield is Scyld. It's really hard.
Yeah,
I know I said I'm going to stick to
consistent.
Scyld and Scaefa, but it feels more natural to say Shield, but I'm not going to. So the Scyld figure and the Scaefa figure are a composite figure.
Yeah.
In that brief Beowulf version, they've been combined. Now we know both from the early reference in Widsith and from all the later Anglo-Saxon references. Namely the king lists that we talked about in the episode and which we will come to later. We know that they are separate figures.
And that they had been considered separate figures.
Yes.
Even at that
time. Both
time.
Before and after, This is...
Yeah. So that seems to be a choice.
Yeah, so that is a choice, and it's interesting. Now, Shippey translates shield sheafing or scale skeefing as shield with a sheaf.
Yeah.
Now that's interesting because that really shows this idea of this figure being a synthesis of shield, war, martiality, and sheaf, agriculture, cultivation.
Yeah, I can see possibly a reason for combining those two is if you want that to be a good king.
Yeah.
Then he needs
precisely,
both,
yes,
he?
precisely,
Yeah.
and it really demonstrates the importance of having both in synthesis. Now, I mentioned this in the episode. Georges de Mézil, a great philologist, historian, etc., has a very famous theory, which I mentioned in this idea of a tripartite social structure. Tripartite.
Yeah, this is
social structure, whereby amongst the Indo-European peoples, you have the priestly class, the warrior class, and the cultivators, the making class, the worker class. Interestingly, Alfred the Great, in his translation of Boethius, which he famously adds a lot to, rather than just translating, he also divides his society into those three sections. And that's the first example of it being done in English, possibly even in Europe, actually it being recognized and laid out in that way. He divides it into the church, the workers, and the soldiers, the warriors. That is widely accepted. This is very famous. I'm not doing anything impressive by mentioning this, but often these figures are seen through that lens. And there is, as I said in the episode, this great question. Obviously, shield represents the warrior class, and sheaf represents the agricultural, the farming class, the producers, the cultivators. But that then leaves this third class, the priestly class.
Yeah, and this is Beowa potentially.
Well, potentially.
But
we'll come to. But I think let's just focus on. Yeah, we're going to focus on Scaefa and Scyld, and then we'll come to Beowa later. We'll go in order. Yeah. Of those characters, those three characters, will hit each in turn. But we have to really divide Scaefa from Scyld a bit to be able to talk about them separately.
Let's deal with them first.
Now, the theory is that in Beowulf, that third member of this tripartite society is the storyteller, him or themself. They are speaking about it through God. There is another theory, as I said in the episode, that God is this third character. They reference God repeatedly. But another idea is that the person writing is perhaps a monk. And so they represent it, and they are aware that the person telling the story is that third element. Now, what I think is interesting about this is this idea of art coming in, music, and so on. Because it might not be, we don't know that Beowulf was, there's a lot of people assume it was written down by a Christian monk, specifically because of the references to Christian belief, and because almost all other things were written down by monks, but we don't know that for sure. We also don't know how much the person who actually wrote it down was altering or adding to it, rather than just transcribing an early tradition or an oral tradition.
That's Beowulf.
Beowulf, we're talking about, yeah. And there's also the fact that when stories were told in Anglo-Saxon times, certainly in the time of Beowulf, they were generally sung, and they were accompanied by a harp, which we would, in modern terms, is technically a lyre, but was referred to as a harp. But this, in fact, is an Anglo-Saxon harp. This is a replica of the harp found at Sutton Hoo, Radwald's burial. So this is a 6th century harp design. This is the harp that would have been played by the shops who were telling the story of Beowulf. And you have heard it, in fact, on our theme tune.
Yeah, hopefully you can just hear a little twinkle of it in
the theme tune. Now, with that in mind, the person telling the story would have been singing and playing music and instrumentation. There is this constant overlap throughout certainly the Germanic myths, but also most traditions that stem from the Indo-European. connect the gods with music and with art. Certainly for the Anglo-Saxons and for the Germanics in general, poetry comes from Woden or Odin, often through drinking the mead of poetry or through divine inspiration. There's another story in this fantastic book, Anglo-Saxon Myths, The Struggle of Seven Kingdoms, where I talk about the story of Caedmon, who was a simple cattle herd, illiterate, who suddenly has a dream.
Yeah,
he's so inept at playing or talking that whenever feasts come and they pass the harp around the table, he has to get up from the table and run away because he's so bad at coming up with stories. And then he has this dream, and an Odinic figure, a Wodinic figure, comes to him in that dream and grants him this ability. And when he wakes up, he can just sing every song. He knows every song, every story, and it comes beautifully and eloquently from his lips. Great little story. And there are other similar examples of this connection between the divine and the artistic. That's standard and established. This connects deeply with Tolkien's theories of
subcreation,
creation and subcreation, which again I detailed in the episode. But essentially, this idea that the most divine act that any human can commit is subcreation. We all exist within the ultimate creation, the creation, and to create within this creation is subcreation, and that is us acting in the image of our creator.
It is effectively an act of devotion
Precisely,
to God.
So far as Tolkien's concerned, and so his own conception of his cosmology in all of his works was that these were acts of subcreation. That's why I think Tolkien picked up on that thread and emphasized the musical aspect in his engagement with this legend when he wrote it as a verse poem, and an excerpt of which I read at the end of the episode. We will come back to that later, I think, because I do consider Tolkien's engagement with it as part of this English continuity and development of the tradition. So we'll come back to that later. But suffice to say, we're going to jump back now and we're going to look at this tripartite nature of stuff. Now, before we get to Beowa, remember this, because we'll come back to Beowa and this notion of the third element of this tripartite theory will come into play. There is another theory alongside this tripartite thing, which is that specifically within the Germanic context, which includes the Anglo-Saxon, it was more of a bipartite division. It wasn't so much about the religious, but it was more explicitly about the martial, the warriors, and the agriculturalists. Fertility. And I'm gonna speak in terms of the Norse stuff here. Even though, as we mentioned, the Norse myths, the main sources for them are from hundreds of years after the point at which we're talking. They're like about 500 years later than Beowulf is. Just to emphasize the big gulf in time there, but they all come from the same roots. In the Norse sources, we see two different tribes of gods, essentially, the Aesir and the Vanir, and they battle initially early on. There's a huge, great war between these two tribes of gods, and the Aesir succeeds, but in the end they end up sort of the survivors of the Vanir synthesize. So the main two we've got are, of the Aesir we have Odin, and of the Vanir we have Freyr. And the Aesir are defined by the warlike element, and the Vanir are defined by the fertility element.
All right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So obviously there we have the equivalent of shield, Scyld, and sheaf, Scaefa.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of now. In those explicit terms, that's from the much later Norse texts, which are directly relevant to the Scandinavian countries. However, there is some evidence that similar beliefs were held much earlier by the Anglo-Saxons. The word for God in Old English is os, and the plural is is. And this,
like Aesir,
there isn't an equivalent. There isn't a surviving equivalent word for Vanir. But as the Aesir were the successful ones, or the winners, That's not necessarily unexpected. And there is comparative evidence from other Indo-European and from other Indo-European cultures that this idea of some ancient battle between two warring godly tribes is a proto-Indo-European myth, which then survives much later throughout. We see it in the classical mythology as well. We see it in most.
Yeah, it's like that. That's everywhere, right?
Comparative mythology shows that this is very plausibly a proto-Indo-European belief that would have been shared by all the descendant cultures of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, which is why I've included a vague version of that in a very briefly, just in the opening, based solely on the Anglo-Saxon, the English sources, which are very few, and the Proto-Indo-European comparative stuff. But yeah, that's in the shop section, which is intentionally more interpretive, whereas it's only a brief period right at the beginning. The rest is much more hard and committed in terms of its historicity.
Yeah, quick side note on your book. Yeah. I really enjoy the way that the first few chapters of this book are based on days of the week. Yeah, essentially. Yeah, that you have something about the moon, then to Woden.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The idea being that that's one of the major the days of the week is the main way in which those gods have survived in current culture, and so that should be both acknowledged and engaged with and emphasized and explored further. That is a continuance of the tradition.
The good old W on the beginning of Wednesday.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Woden, that's what specifies it's Woden, not Odin. So that's so there's this element too. This idea of the Aesir and the Vanir, the martial and the fertile. Right? And the synthesis of those two extremes is what we see in Freyr joining Odin in the, to become sort of the pantheon of Norse mythology, and it's also what we see in Beowulf when we have this synthesis between shield and sheaf, skilled skeefing. That is why now, generally speaking, skilled skeefing means skilled son of Sceaf. But that's why. But that idea of a synthesis, but because they are a composite figure in terms of the stories around them, and because of this idea of combining the two, this synthesis, that's why this shield with a sheaf theory, which is not directly what the text as we have it says, but is a perfectly solid theory. That's where that comes from. This idea that it's shield with a sheaf. As I mentioned, that's interesting, especially as in the Scandinavian sources, shield or skilled is the focus. Yeah. So here, Beowulf is almost sort of going slightly in that tradition, or nodding towards that tradition by making skilled the focus. Yeah. And bearing in mind,
naming the composite figure after
skilled, rather than Sceaf with a skilled. Yeah. It could be Sceaf skilding. Yeah. Although Sceaf is never a descendant of skilled. It's only the other way around.
That's interesting. That's the way maybe that acknowledges the lineage in the correct order.
There we've got that. There's also this element, if we're going to jump back to Widsith. So we talk about Widsith specifies that Scaefa was the king of the Langobards, the Lombards as we call them now. Now the Langobards, the one thing all the ancient sources agree on about the Langobards is that there's hardly any of them. And because of that, they're really, really, really warlike and dangerous. Like they are insanely brutal and bloodthirsty.
And it's Scaefa that's
Scaefa, because Scaefa, then the sheaf settles them. So the bringing of agriculture to the ultimate warriors, these brutal animal warriors, it is the bringing of agriculture which then can settle them and can tame almost this savage beast. Right. Yeah. This is very much what we talk about in the story as I give it. This idea of agriculture settling down this tribalistic warfare.
But from the point of view of Widsith, the Lombards are like an outsider tribe, aren't they? They're not. Yeah. They're not Angles or Saxons.
No, they're not. No, they're not.
Jews or Frisians.
No. They're very specifically not. And in fact, the Langobards are further away from all that because those so they're not a North Germanic tribe. Langobards. They're slightly further off.
Is that significant?
It's still a Germanic tribe.
It's this character's placed as a king of an outside.
Well, I don't think it is significant, particularly that it's specifically outside. Because remember, at the time of Widsith,
this is being written.
Widsith is pretty early on. Widsith is written relatively early on in the Anglo-Saxon settlement of England.
Right.
So all the stories are from other places, and all this engagement with lots of different Germanic figures is done. And in Widsith explicitly is a huge list of exotic places and people from all over the known world and all over mythology. So that's not so. That
Tales
isn't
of kings from all over.
Yeah.
Okay.
But all of which are considered part of this sort of same tradition.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mention that. So we'll now go beyond Beowulf, and as I said in the podcast episode, there are loads and loads and loads of king lists.
Yeah.
Then, which give essentially the pedigree of different kings, different royal houses. Many of them feature both Scaefa and Scyld. As I said in the episode, I'm trying to call them Scaefa and Scyld. There are many different spellings, and the pronunciation. There are many different pronunciations, and it shouldn't really be Scaefa and Scyld, but I've explained why I'm saying that. I'm keeping Scaefa because that's the earliest spelling and construction. That's how it is in Widsith, Scaefa. Scyld is pretty much Scyld throughout. Where was I, James?
King lists.
King lists.
They feature both Scaefa and Scyld.
Yeah, in different places. Sometimes they're quite far removed, but I believe that Scyld is always a descendant of Scaefa.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Woden will jump about.
Yeah, Woden does jump about a bit weirdly. I'm not going to get bogged down in the king lists, essentially, but what the king's lists show us, for our purposes, are essentially they really nail down and establish that Scyld and Scaefa are two separate figures, and that Scyld comes from Scaefa. All right. It emphasizes the likely godlike or godly genesis of those figures, because we see them alongside Woden, Saxnot, and Geat, who are also gods, ancestral god figures. So Scaefa and Scyld are constantly used as ancestral god figures. And also, the king lists at length affirm and reaffirm to us this Anglo-Saxon idea that they descend from Noah, that Scaefa is this secret son of Noah, this fourth son of Noah, and was born on Noah's Ark.
Well, so the king's list suggests that.
Yeah,
as well.
the king's list
they list Noah.
Yeah. Some of them do. Some of them had Noah in, and the king's list changed throughout the centuries.
Yeah.
And they were often, certainly within the Anglo-Saxon rule of England, so up until 1066. They are certainly used for political reasons, and they are changed, and generations are added in order to emphasize the great pedigree and the clear and overt right to kingship that this particular individual may have. Alfred, as much as I'm an Alfred stan, which is what Alfredian is a derivation of, he's kind of. He's deeply a part of this, and one of this pedigree references is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was, of course, an Alfredian project, and this talks at length about this. For anyone interested in all of this stuff, by the way, the book on the subject is Shield and Sheaf, Expanding the Analogues by Alexander M. Bruce. This is the book to get. It's not even that big, but it's kind of the book on it. It pretty much doubles, I think it even potentially triples the analogues that have to what had previously been recognized. He finds and recognizes 43 different sources in both the English tradition and the Danish and the Icelandic. Yeah, it's also got the original texts for all of these as well, and translations. So it's a really valuable book, and everything I'm talking about, really, almost everything I'm talking about, it also talks about. And brilliant book, highly recommend it.
Can I quickly ask about Widsith?
Yeah,
because you spoke about how Beowulf was was not necessarily written, could have been written down out of an oral tradition.
Yeah.
Probably was, or...
Probably was, yeah. I think so, yeah. There's also debate, but yeah, almost certainly it was.
Is the same true of Widsith? Is that also...
Yeah, so there is a theory about Widsith. So Widsith is the storyteller, and there is a theory that the poem of Widsith would have existed that way, almost as a mnemonic device for him to remember his stories, his best stories, by being able to recite kind of the contents almost of the different heroes and kings. So then he can tell the stories of each of those people, right? But also he could then recite it as a kind of, this is what I've got to offer. It's kind of saying his repertoire. And then other people can, then whoever's listening can say, okay, give us King Atla, give us Hermod. Yeah, you can then dig deeper. Yeah. There's also this idea that it links in with this motif we see coming up quite a lot of Woden giving extremely long life to shops, to scops, to storytellers. Really long life. And so he actually has been present at all of these events because he's been alive for 1,000 years. Great. Because he's this great storyteller. And we see that cropping up in quite a few. And again, where one of those theories don't have to be separate, they can exist together really nicely in that matted hair of folk, which I really enjoy. So that's the nature of Widsith. Widsith very much would almost certainly have been a something. I mean, in fact, very little, certainly in the early stuff, would have just been written down by its author. It would have almost everything comes from oral tradition. Yeah, almost everything. Later, there are people who are composing written down, but that's much later. Certainly in this early section, it's all coming from oral tradition.
Yeah. So when we're talking about a written down version of it, that's kind of at the end of.
And also it's just the earliest surviving we've got as well. It's important to remember. Everything I'm saying here, these are not the only versions. It's not saying it dates to this point. I'm just saying we've got evidence from this point that by the time this was written, this tradition existed. And that
by the time it was written down, it existed.
That tradition could have been around for hundreds of years, millennia even, before it was written down.
I think
not even before it was around, but before this particular thing that survives was written.
Yeah,
because it could have been written down, but in loads of other contexts, but they just don't survive to the present day.
I think that was what I was asking. Essentially, that was what I was driving at. Is it potentially much older?
It is potentially. It is potentially. And the thing is, even if you then say, but look at this internal evidence, it references this thing, so it couldn't be older than this thing happening. But of course, it could, and it could have just been updated when that thing happened.
Which is the nature of an oral tradition.
Which is the nature of an oral tradition, precisely. So. Talking about Beowulf, and then this interesting thing about, as you will have heard in the version I read from Tom Shippey's Beowulf translation, we don't hear mention of of Scyld skeefing either as a baby when he arrives being surrounded by weaponry or having a sheaf of corn under his head.
Okay, yeah.
Interesting.
Well, he mentions that he's a foundling.
Yeah.
And
he arrives naked on a boat.
Oh, yeah, okay. But he doesn't mention the weaponry or the sheaf. Okay.
The evidence for those traditions, and this is what's really interesting. So in this whole genesis of the English development of this story, the earliest reference to Sheaf and Shield is Anglo-Saxon, is English, and that's Widsith. The latest is also English, and that's this 15th century Henry VI's pedigree roll.
Okay. Yeah.
So what we've got there is, I mean, those are about 800 years apart.
Yeah. Pedigree roll is that in a way like a king list? Or is it?
Yeah, a bit like that, but it's much later.
Yeah.
And it also goes into a bit more detail and depth. But so we've got, just in that written record, there's 800 years of this one legend being developed specifically in the English tradition. And during that time, there's also written evidence and sources that come in, as I say, the Danish and the Icelandic. But we're not going to look into those. Those are not I think those are beyond the scope of this discussion. We're focusing just on the English sources.
There's potentially a point of bifurcation.
Yeah, this
has
book.
occurred.
Oh no! In fact, there's no potential. In fact, there's
definitely-
absolutely no potential about it.
Well,
They're very different traditions.
Yeah,
very
I was,
different.
I was
There's
hedging
no-
my bets.
Yeah, no. They're kind of. They describe totally different figures.
Because
really.
I think that is important in why you've chosen the sources that you've chosen, is that it's because you're looking at this particular strand.
Well, yeah,
and to confuse it laterally with a
So
later
this is
tradition is going to be.
I'm only looking for all of these stories across this podcast, across this project. I'm only using English sources.
Yeah, well,
explicitly. I'm only using English sources, and I'm explicitly not muddying the waters, especially when it comes to Anglo-Saxon stuff. People really tried to fill in the gaps by just transposing much later
patching it with
Norse stuff. Yeah,
with stuff
and
transposed from a different.
It shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be done. It's bad. And there are very, very subtle, careful ways that it can be done, but it's not. But they just plaster all over it and they completely change it. So, and that's in any context. But in this context specifically, as I mentioned, the Danish and Icelandic characters are very different, and in fact contradictory. They actively they don't work with the English tradition.
Yeah.
It's useful in an academic sense, very useful. And all that is in this book, which I held up to reference again.
Yeah.
That covers all of the sources, so do get that if you're interested. But in the English one specifically, we have all these kings lists. The next really interesting development of the story we find recorded in Aethelweard's Chronicle, which is, I think, the 11th century. Late 10th, early 11th, I think.
This is after Beowulf.
This is after Beowulf. And in fact, Aethelweard's Chronicle is the first... Aethelweard. Yeah. Isn't it good? Aethelweard. So Aethelweard's Chronicle is the earliest chronicle we've got surviving chronicle history that's written by a layman, not by a member of the clergy, not by a monk. Aethelweard, this is a sort of Latin... You can call it a translation, but it's not really a translation in a modern sense. Just as I mentioned earlier, King Alfred's translation of Boethius, it's not a translation in as much as it's a translation with commentary as part of the body of the text. So a translator historically would have felt more than free to add their own thoughts or to make changes or to edit and alter as they went along. And so that's what we get with Aethelweard's Chronicle. It's a development. It's his version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Cool. Okay.
Written in Latin in the late 10th century.
Yeah.
Now, he was, Aethelweard was, he wasn't a clergyman. He was a member of the royal family. I think he was descended from Aethelred or Aethelbert, one of those chaps.
Brilliant Anglo-Saxon names.
Brilliant. All good stuff. So now, what is interesting about this one? Now, so this is the very late 900s. So this is between 1 and 3 centuries older than Beowulf. I mean, more recent than Beowulf. Right? Okay, so we had Widsith, and then we have Beowulf, and then we've got loads of kings lists. But this is the Aethelweard's Chronicle is the next one that gets interesting, and I'll tell you for why. Because Aethelweard's Chronicle, you may remember that in Beowulf, as you heard it, the baby who came on the ship, unlike in our story, wasn't surrounded by weaponry and didn't have a sheaf of corn under his head.
Yeah, well, he's described as arriving
naked baby arriving on a boat,
a foundling
on a boat with no crewman.
But the weaponry is not mentioned.
No
the sheaf is
weaponry,
not
and
mentioned.
precisely.
Okay.
It doesn't actually explain why he is called Sheaf. He just comes and he just is called Sheaf. Or skilled skeeving. Yeah, skilled skeeving. Thank you. That's very important. Now, in this version, as with all the kings lists in the English tradition, he's explicitly skeef, not skilled skeeving.
Yeah.
So that composite thing doesn't exist there yet in the name. He's skeef, and skilled comes later. Skilled is his son. But he is specified as being surrounded when he's found by arms. By armor, by weaponry. So this is where the first time we have recorded this weaponry edition.
Right.
So by this time, by the late 10th century, and when Aethelweard is writing, by then we've got this tradition of him being of skeef, or Scaefa, sheaf, being surrounded by weaponry. So what's really interesting about that is that here we have that synthesis that we had in Beowulf, but just expressed differently. So in Beowulf, that synthesis between the martial and the agricultural is in the name.
Sides.
Shield skeefing, shield sheafing,
And
shield
then,
with a sheaf.
As we move on, it becomes demonstrated in his
when that
surroundings.
Composite figure is split apart again, we're refining the synthesis by having Scaefa or sheaf surrounded by weaponry. That's what's happening there. Also, I think that this is followed by about, I think, 200 years later. From 1125 to, I think, the mid 1100s, we've got William of Malmesbury writing. And here we get another version of this story where we don't have the addition of the arms, we don't have the weaponry, but we do have the sheaf of corn.
Okay, so you've got, and that's Scaefa with a sheaf of corn, but no weaponry.
Yeah, but it does say the reason he ends up being called Scaefa is because he arrives with a sheaf of corn beneath his head.
That does make sense.
Which makes sense, right?
I mean, if he's with a sheaf of corn and the weapons, you call him after one, but not the other.
Well, you might call him sheaf with a shield, sheaf with a sword.
Yeah.
Rather than shield with a sheaf. But yeah, so that's where that comes from. And also then, this is, interestingly, you earlier mentioned this idea of him being a king of the Lombards, the Langobards.
Yeah.
There's significance in that. Well, in this version, in William of Malmesbury's account, which, by the way, is a development of Aethelweard's, he's essentially, his main source is clearly Aethelweard, but then he's adding these extra additions. William of Malmesbury specifies and emphasizes that he is a descendant of the Angles, and thus of the Anglo-Saxons, and thus of the English. Explicitly places him as a descendant king of our people.
Yeah, lineage again being very important.
Yeah, precisely. Now, most of them, there are other English sources, but they generally refer back to these. The next really interesting one for our purposes is also the latest, and that is the 15th century pedigree roll for Henry VI. Now here we don't so much have anything new, but what we do have is it emphasizes that specific immediate lineage, which is there in Beowulf, of Sceaf, Scyld, and then Beowa. All right. Now, other versions of this have placed Beowa later or separated Sceaf and Scyld and have other people in between. That's all very changeable.
Yeah.
Orders shift about. And I don't think that really conflicts with anything, because the genesis of all those kings lists, very varied and very politicized and sort of very haphazard. If anyone's interested, do look further into it. Have a look at Alexander Bruce's book, Scyld and Scef, expanding the Analogues. Look into the Anglo-Saxon kings list themselves, because they're their own field of study. And they're useful in this context for mentioning and for establishing descent and so on, and as we've already discussed. But I won't go into much more detail on them, because it's just a massive sidebar. But so here we go back to this with the 15th century pedigree roll. It reaffirms Scaefa, Scyld, Beowa.
Yeah.
And it then goes on to specify that Beowa had 9 sons.
9 being that magic number.
And moreover, that those 9 sons are the descendants of all the 9 Germanic tribes who would have anything to do with Britain.
The ancestors of those tribes.
Yeah. No. They produced them. They produced them. Yeah. So the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Goths, the Wendels, the Geats, and the Frisians. All of them.
Poor old Frisians.
Always last. But what's really interesting with that is that, remember, those aren't just the Anglo-Saxon tribes. Those are the 9 tribes who also produce all the Vikings who ever come, and the Normans.
Oh, and
the Normans. That's a good time to,
in. I was just thinking about
the Normans.
Which version of this story your King Rufus would have heard.
Well, so interestingly, actually, after Rufus's time, so from around the 1200s, actually by the end of the 12th century, the Anglo-Normans are kind of no longer, really don't consider themselves much related to the continental Normans, and they've really started to identify with Britain more. And it's from around then that we start seeing a lot more stuff, which really emphasizes that we see this, the genesis of the beginnings of this in William of Malmesbury, stuff that really emphasizes the common Germanic descent of the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans. And here we see this made explicit. So here we see that Scyld and Scaefa, that Scaefa, in fact, specifically, then Scyld, then Beowa, but Scaefa is the ancestor of all the peoples who have made up England.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans.
The Normans. Presumably important for the King of England's,
pretty important.
Heritage.
Yeah, there you go.
You want to legitimize the Normans
everything
in that way.
And there's these 9 tribes. I think that's really fascinating. And that demonstrates, and bearing in mind that back with William of Malmesbury already establishes that this is specifically an ancestral figure for the Angles, who are obviously the nominal ancestors for the English. We see then, since almost immediately after the Norman conquest, certainly we know only within living memory of Anglo-Saxon rule, certainly at least within living memory, the shield and sheaf figures, Scaefa is this ancestral figure for all of us, for all of the English, is for the English.
Yeah,
that genesis is really interesting and emphasizes the important role that this tradition, this myth, this legend holds within English culture and the genesis of that English culture, and in distinction to the tradition as it develops over that same millennium in Scandinavia, in Iceland, and in Denmark, both of which are very different ones. As I say, in Denmark, he's a Danish king, and he's a good king, good kinning, but that's it. He certainly doesn't have this magical, godly, cyclical element. That doesn't exist there, where he transcends humanity and even place and time to become king of many places, an ancestor to many peoples. And that, I think, combines perfectly with the cyclical nature of it, which is why in our story, it's placeless.
Yeah. Because
there's loads of different places given. In the entirety, in that sort of 800-year chunk of English written sources, then you get loads of different places that Scaefa was the king of, and that Scyld was the king of. Loads of different ones. And in mine, it finishes with a new baby washing up to another shore and being king. Yeah. So it becomes this kind of beautiful, permanent thing whereby this figure is being reborn and arriving on many countless shores. And maybe this first shore, and that's why, as I said in the podcast, I've embraced this idea that he is the ultimate ancestor, the first man, because, and maybe this very first version is sort of transcends any specific place, any actual literal geographical unit or kingdom, and then it goes to many, many others, and so all of those, so that synthesizes all these traditions, all those different places are equally the country where Scaefa or Scyld comes to. And in fact, in my own book, you might have noticed that in the story as he had it, Scyld is then sent off, also sacrificed. In my book, when it comes to the section that covers the Beowulf period, it is that Scyld who arrives then as a baby on their shore. But the baby has an old scar, much older than he could possibly be, which is clear from it's been sacrificed. So then that synthesizes that with then the Beowulf version that's told, whereby Scaefing arrives, and he's kind of a product of that earlier Scaefa and Scyld myth.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're doing.
Yeah. So by embracing this cyclical nature of the story, it gets to exist and re-exist. So instead of it being it can only happen in one place, it happens in every place, because the whole point of it is death and rebirth. It's this lovely cycle. A baby arrives, an old man is sent away. A baby arrives, an old man is sent away. It comes back and back and back and back and back.
Do you know what I was thinking of when we were talking about this cyclical, the baby arriving and the cycle restarting? I think it was making me think of a couple of things, but I went to 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Of course you did. When do you not?
No, I like Arthur C. Clarke was a clever guy, but I don't think he was referencing this. But like I don't know. There's something like the baby arriving back, floating around Earth at the end. Yeah, I don't know if you can think of that being an actual. If there's any any legs to that,
I don't know what you're talking about.
Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, why not? This idea of a baby. I mean, also you can connect it with Moses.
Moses was the other one that popped into
the other one. There's also in the New Forest specifically. There's this tradition of William Brewer, born in the breaks.
I remember that story.
That's it's in that book, New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice Stratford. And that is attested from at least the 1500s. This idea of this baby being found on the back of a little shield or boat, which has been going down a river and has got caught up in the briars, essentially, which is where Brewer comes from. And because of that, he's taken up by the king finds him. So the king takes him and gives him to a family called Brewer to be fostered, and then they raise him, and he becomes he actually becomes the sheriff of Nottingham, and in fact he is plausibly one of the sources for the sheriff of Nottingham in the Robin Hood stories. And there's various ways that can also, as that story is told, that can signify, again, this kind of synthesis, but for the forest specifically. What is interesting is that the forest itself, the New Forest, was at one point an Anglo-Saxon kingdom in its own right. So there's always some plausible, tenuous, sure, but plausibly it could be that there is story, some memory there, some local oral memory of this idea that for an area to be synthesized with the places around it, there's this idea of a king coming from some godly origin, just being gifted and arriving like that, and that then helps to transition this transitionary period to some lovely peacetime, which is certainly what comes after William Brewer in the New Forest. Who knows? I mean, that's certainly tenuous. That's supposition. That's baseless theory, but it's a nice idea. I
love a bit of baseless theory.
Pretty good band. Very good band.
So where were we with the history of? We were reintroducing this.
This idea of Beowa.
The tripartite.
Yeah, so now we've got Beowa coming back in. And it's really interesting the importance of Beowa, who now, here, by being the explicit progenitor of these 9 tribes, all of whom then unite Britain. So all the peoples of Britain. And this is true, frankly. The Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans do all come from the same stock. They are all from the same place. They're all Germanic, and so that this isn't even a wild reach. It's just emphasizing that truth that all those peoples
pointing
are.
It out. Pointing it out for the
pointing out, just reminding you that everyone and certainly genetic science has demonstrated that there is barely any difference between those populations. Even though you can tell the difference, the actual difference genetically is negligible. It's almost nothing. Even, to be honest, between the Germanic peoples and the Celtic peoples, there's very, very little difference. There's obviously more, but again, because they split off just earlier from the same people, the same Indo-European people, before they divide.
Well, I guess that's the purpose of a story like this, is regardless of cultural divides and having kind of formed different. It's trying to unite.
Unite the people
of a country.
It is uniting, and emphasizing this importance.
What is similar about them? Saying we all come from this common origin.
And it's also, on that note, actually, it's something quite interesting. Why does this little baby who arrives? Why does he get made into a king? See, that's weird. What's this?
I did have to suspend my disbelief there for a moment.
What's this baby's descent?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, because we're not saying that kingship comes either from winning it in battle through force or from great ancestors. It's just something else. It's something that's gifted. It's this godly thing, this supernatural thing. And then the degree is also different versions. Sometimes the baby is treated as miraculous and then becomes king because of that. Yeah. Sometimes the baby is just so he's taken in and treated as their own by the people who find him, but he is so wonderful as he ages that he then is made a king. So either way...
he doesn't do any like pulling of a sword out of a stone or...
Nope, he does not pull a sword out of a stone.
Any of that stuff.
No. This is in the English traditions. In the Scandinavian traditions, the Danish and the Icelandic, we get a very different life for Scyld. Yeah. A very, very, very different life. But I just don't think it's relevant because that isn't stuff that exists in the English tradition. And it also doesn't... One could say, but maybe it did and it just doesn't survive. But there's not really much... There's not much in the way of a hint of it. And the development in the English tradition is so clearly along this specific route, whereby the focus is Scaefa, not Scyld, and it becomes about the cyclical thing and the symbolism of the sheaf and the shield.
Yeah, so apart from this 9 tribes thing, the presence of Beowa in there is...
So I think we can then see with Beowa, we do see something... We see a way in which potentially the third element of this tripartite structure is introduced. Yeah. We have sheaf, obviously agricultural. We have shield, obviously warlike. But then we have Beowa. Now, if Beowa meaning barleycorn,
you'd think agriculture again.
Yeah. But it's the again element rather than the agriculture element. Yeah. It's the fact that he then represents this rebirth, this cycle. It's that rebirth which is godly.
Podcast.
I think we did mention this
idea of rebirth being the thing that becomes exceptional.
We did mention this in the podcast.
Birth, death.
Afterbirth.
Birth, death are part of the natural process. Rebirth is
that's the magical thing. Yeah. And Beowa is sheaf. The words kind of mean they're variations of the same thing. So Beowa is sheaf reborn.
Yeah, and of course, the way that I don't know what the connection is to your sources, but the way you told the story, the way that I heard the story, is that the rebirth of Beowa happens almost simultaneously with the exit, the death.
Yeah. I emphasise that. I emphasise that. Yeah. In the sources, it's vague. It doesn't clarify it. But Beowulf specifies that Beowa comes in. But I did that consciously. That's my way of synthesizing the varying sources and the various different versions and facts. It's a kind of way of making them all simultaneously work, those of the English tradition specifically. So I think with Beowa then, we see both this magical element come in, but also we can then, and this is, again, I mentioned before in the podcast, the tradition I'm working in is the English tradition, not just the Old English tradition, but the English tradition. We already have it transcending just the Old English and going right up to the 1400s.
Yeah.
The next time that Beowa really comes in to English culture is with the song John Barleycorn.
Right, yes. Yeah.
Because Beowa means barleycorn.
Barleycorn, yeah.
So the personification of Barleycorn as an individual, as a person, is essentially what we have with this story.
And of course, in the story of the song John Barleycorn, it's the way that I've heard people describe it is that it's as if you're doing horrible things to a man, but then by the end of the song we realise that it's actually he's the corn.
Yeah, he's the corn.
You're just doing farm stuff.
Well, you don't realise by the end of the song because he's called John Barleycorn throughout the song, so you don't suddenly realise, Barleycorn.
Oh my God, it was Barleycorn.
Yeah, it's more of a joke, but But specifically, what's interesting there, so if we take Beowa as a personification of Barleycorn, we then find that happening again. I think the earliest. I think there's a 17th century reference to this. I think there's in Scotland there's a song where Alan of the Malt is personified. It's a totally different song. But you get a personification of one of the ingredients for beer. And I think that's in the 1600s. And I think maybe you get John Barleycorn proper about 50 years later in England. I think, off the top of my head, it might be 1700s. But that's only about 200 years after the pedigree roll. We start getting... so in the 1400s, we've got Barleycorn is personified as this human who is the ancestor of all these of the 9 Germanic tribes who make up all of the English as then.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of hundred years later, we get Barleycorn personified again. And of course, there's probably no direct relation between these. I'm not claiming that, certainly. But there is a symbolic or a semiotic relationship in that it is explicitly Barleycorn being personified. And this idea of death and rebirth. I mean, I think that's interesting. We've got death and rebirth and the personification of Barley as a human in this tradition. And we then have those two, and those are quite distinct elements. Just a couple of hundred years later, we get them again in folk song.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that should be ignored. And I'm not saying that one directly leads on to the other, but I am saying that some notion of that clearly survived in some vague way long enough that did not feel a reach. The culture who created the second clearly has the remnants of the former still existing in its ploughed field. The ingredients are all there still, and so then we get that. And then obviously in the song John Barleycorn, which there are historians of folk music who go much further than me in this and who claim outright that John Barleycorn is this pagan remnant. That it's unique in that regard. I don't think it is, because
I could kind of understand how someone could make that claim, but it seems
I think that if you do that,
strident.
Well, to do that, you have to take the latest. So you have to take some of the latest versions of the song and ignore the earliest versions of the song. Not really like that. The earliest versions of the song are far more comical and far more. And in fact, there's lots of other people who are personified figures involved in the making of beer.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it is actually a remnant of that, but I do think that it's significant that this personification and human sacrifice element is there in both of these, and they're not separated by very far. You were talking about Thomas Hardy. It's not much further a distance between Thomas Hardy's earliest work and us making this podcast than it is between that pedigree roll and the earliest version of John Barleycorn. When you look at it like that, that's not wild at all. Like when you think that's not crazy to think that existed somehow in the public consciousness, in the cultural zeitgeist. And even that there may well have been other examples of it from then that haven't survived, that we don't have. That's important to remember too. For every song from then that was recorded and saved, there will be 100 others at least that just were forgotten, that weren't recorded or written down. There could have been many other examples of this that we don't have any evidence for. Certainly later versions of the song do lean into this this idea of human sacrifice and potentially pre-Christian stuff.
They become less comic and more...
more unnerving, more strange.
Eerie.
And the degree to which that is part of the 19th century Romanticism movement is hard to say. And then later on, it's certainly heavily influenced by the fact that some scholars start recognizing it and saying, "Oh, look, it's pagan." And then all the Margaret Murray witch cult hypothesis comes in, and then the 20th century, and before that, the Golden Bough sort of influences a bit. But I think it's really interesting then that before we have this again, we still have this figure, this Beowa figure in John Barleycorn. Before, in the 19th century, the rediscovery of Beowulf. So when Beowulf is rediscovered and the characters are refound in this early source and re-acknowledged, and they become widely known once again and gradually are reintroduced into the mainstream consciousness, that Beowa character still exists. He didn't actually die out. So weirdly, this personification of Barleycorn, this third character, actually transcended that gap of a few centuries, which cut off Scaefa and Scyld from the present day.
Okay, so after that role, what the royalty,
the pedigree role.
After that, we sort of lose Scaefa and Scyld for a couple of centuries.
I mean, excluding the odd reprint, but in any meaningful sense, we lose them. And it's
along with Beowulf.
Beowulf. It's hard to say when Beowulf disappears, but Beowulf isn't found again until the 1800s.
When something,
it's hard to say when people stop knowing about it.
Poor old Shakespeare didn't get. Beowulf.
Poor Shakespeare didn't get Beowulf.
Pity.
Poor. Well, there's theories.
He did okay.
No, he did all right. But actually, I have a theory on this, which we're not going to discuss now, but which in time to come may blow this wide open. We'll see. We'll see. I'll bookmark this. I'm not going to give anything more away because
it's top secret.
It's top secret stuff. Okay. But more or less. The general consensus, as we understand it, Beowulf then disappears.
People stopped really kind of paying attention to
being aware of Beowulf, and then it's rediscovered in the 1800s.
And along with Beowulf's
and then gradually and Scaefa and Scyld, the Scaefa and Scyld story as it exists in Beowulf is then reintroduced along with Beowulf, and then from their study starts rediscovering all these other elements of it. So we find it.
Yeah.
But that Beowa, if we take Beowa simply as this personification of Barleycorn, who also somehow personifies death and rebirth, then that figure, by that definition, that survives, where Scaefa and Scyld do not survive. That's really interesting. And then obviously Tolkien, the great philologist, the great man, at some point in the 20th century, he then writes his own version of this. I think this is included in The Lost Road. I think it's a story that his character Elfwine tells. He tells this poem, sings this song of King Sheaf, as Tolkien modernizes it, King Sheaf. And essentially he tells a version of it where King Sheaf is a king of the Langobards, as we get in Scaefa, in Widsith. And he is the father of 7 tribes, which includes the English tribes. So you can see he's very much playing with those same things. It's a beautiful poem. I read an excerpt in the episode. Do seek it out. It can be found with correct Googling. I think it's on some Tolkien wiki. Tolkien.
How do you spell Sheave?
Sheave.
Okay.
King Sheaf is what it's called. And it's beautiful. And then other people have since engaged with it. And we have it in my version now, published in 2022, which I like because it's something which is back. It is a part of, and I don't really think it was entirely lost, because when something has been around and has been so intrinsic to a culture, to a cultural consciousness for so long, even when the explicit narrative is no longer being retold, all the sort of stuff that narrative built or underpinned is all still there, you know?
Yeah. The sort of
the framework.
What's the way of
the framework?
The landscape that's built up around it still retains.
So then, when it comes back, it clicks in and it makes sense and it survives.
I do feel that way about this story, which is so nice that it's so old that I still feel like it has something that I connect to in it.
It's not just that it's so old, it's that it was so intrinsic and told for so long. Throughout the entire development of English culture, it was there, and it only disappeared for a few centuries. The brief patch in which it wasn't around is a tiny period compared to all the period that it was around.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. It isn't just that, this is a story from 1,000 years ago. It's that this story has been so prevalent. It's been there throughout. It was there throughout the Anglo-Saxon pagan period. It was there throughout the Anglo-Saxon Christianization period. It was there throughout the Viking period. It was there throughout the Normans, right up into the 1400s.
Well, you were talking about the way that it rolls with the times and appeals to people of each epoch. And what I find really appealing is that it still is. And
now it comes back, and we still love it. I mean, it's still here.
Like it feels like it has a lot to say.
There's also other strange indications of its value. So there's I think a 13th century chronicle from a monastery in Abingdon, I think, which talks about a weird ritual that was conducted to settle a land dispute between... Abingdon is in Oxfordshire, I think. And it was to settle some land dispute over who owned a little river meadow or something. And to settle this dispute, they got a shield and they put a sheaf on it and they put a wax candle on the sheaf and they lit it. And they let the shield just go up the river, and the shield went up the river and just kind of stopped and circled, and it kind of said who that bit belonged to.
Which
and then came back.
Came back.
Yeah, then came back. And which is why I then include that in the story as I tell it, because that is really important. This idea that this thing tells you what to do. So that's what the first time when in my story when Scyld is born and they have what's going to happen. That's what Scaefa does. But he includes the baby, and it goes back, and then it comes back to him. So he knows that's good. And then later on, he does the full-on sacrifice, but that's this kind of engagement.
Yeah.
So that ritual was used, and we have no idea why. We don't know what the cultural context was, but this is being done by explicit Christian monks centuries after Christianization, centuries after, hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's what a mystery, what a strange, weird mystery. But it was there, and that really demonstrates this idea that it exists in this public consciousness. This idea of... This also ties back in with ancient symbolism, truly Indo-European, if not Proto-Indo-European symbolism of fire in water. And that's really powerful. And the addition of the candle on that little ritual is really significant, because that adds this other element then. To the lovely matted hair of the folk that we see in this tale. This constant development, these constant accretions of elements, none of which undermine or destroy or deconstruct any of the early ones, but are constantly adding to and fleshing out and making it richer, almost like a reliquary. For anyone who doesn't know what a reliquary is, that is a relic or a piece of a saint which is worshipped is the wrong word. It isn't worshipped, it's sanctified. I think. I'm not a Catholic. Sorry, I've got not there's anything wrong with that. So quite often it will begin with just an old bone.
Yeah.
And this old bone will then be cherished. This is the thigh bone of St. Oswald, for example. And then the next generation might make a really beautiful stand for it. The generation after that might get their greatest jeweler to coat it in gold, to gild it, and then to add precious stones to the stand it's on.
So generation by generation.
And then generation by generation, more and more stuff is added to it to glorify this thing. So by the end, you have this astonishing item, which every generation is enriched, and it doesn't matter anymore who that bone belonged to. This item has been venerated for generations, and the artistry that is involved in it has elevated it regardless of what you believe. It's hugely powerful. And again, we have this intersection between art and religion that we've been talking about and referring back to a lot in this. This idea of artistic endeavor, artistic creation, artistic expression as being somehow godly, supernatural, or magical. And we started, I think, in the podcast by talking about this idea of being spellbound, how a story to the Anglo-Saxons is a spell, and to cast a spell is to tell a story, and it magics up its listeners. The audience is spellbound, literally. This line between magic, art, between magic and story, between the religious and the artistic. It's so amorphous and thin and vague, and it moves about. And these two, I think really these are two sides of the same coin. They are not separate things. It's complex stuff. It's knotty stuff. It's matted hair. And this is not stuff that we're going to end up with any clear... And one of the lovely things about Shield and Sheaf, and I think about, and as to why it's been so successful in having such long life, there's just so much to it. You can't boil it down and say, okay, this is the story. They are historical figures and they're this. This is the true story. This is the correct story.
It's not a knot that you would hope to untie or should even want to.
No, it's not even...
It's not even a knot.
It isn't one knot, no. Because the Danish thing is its own thing. It's completely different, the Danish development and tradition. Ditto the Icelandic. The English is unlike either of those. Obviously, those two are closer to each other than either of them are to the English, but they're still very distinct from each other. I really, really, really love this ancient story and the feel of... There's something so powerful about this bizarre image of a naked baby arriving on a ship, just empty, from who knows where, who knows who.
Who knows who.
And just arriving and then raising this baby, and this baby is... And when you add in the strange weaponry and the sheaf of corn beneath his head, the symbolism there is so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, that feeling of him coming completely out of the unknown, but
with these items. Yeah.
And also all of that stuff early on of him imagining the land and it coming into being and imagining people, and then he arrives and there are people.
Yeah.
Like that sort of creation... it's eerie. It's uncanny.
My thinking there was that that's both a creation myth, but it's also, that's the experience of a baby. When a baby, for the first time, sees things, it wouldn't think those things already exist. It would just, the line between you creating it and it already existing doesn't exist. For a baby, all that exists is themselves. Exactly. So that's kind of this, it's both of those things simultaneously. It's this kind of creation, but creation as a baby would create.
As it is a kind of condensing of the development of a society, it's an experiential development of a human being.
Yeah. Phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, you might say.
You might.
There's a fun thing. So for our American audience, when we say corn, by the way, sheaf of corn, we're referring to wheat corn or barley corn, something like that, not to maize or corn on the cob. There was an amusing... in my own book, there is the very good illustrator, and I take some pleasure in the fact that the very good illustrator of this book of myths, many of which are pagan myths, is named Jesus. Or Jesus. He's very good, Jesus Sotes, and he did a beautiful illustration for Sheaf and Shield. Let me just find it. There we go. There it is. There's a little sheaf, Scaefa, sheaf of corn, you can just see, and then the bed of blades. Now, the reason I say this is because, obviously, when Jesus hears the word corn, he thinks of maize. Yeah. He thinks corn on the cob.
Corn on the cob.
The original illustration of this did not have these lovely ears of wheat. It had loads of corn on the cob. And I did have to point out...
Somehow comical.
It was very comical. It was very silly. I had to point it out, and they did say, "Oh, well, maybe that can just be artistic license." But I had to no, we really do need to change that, and we did, and I'm glad we did. And it's gorgeous. It looks much better for it. It is good killing.
So yeah, with Scaefa coming in on this little boat. Actually, that illustration of a little boat is I love the illustration. But when I was listening to the story, I was imagining a much bigger boat.
A much bigger. Well, I think in Beowulf it's a bigger boat, but in other depictions it's not. Sometimes when the baby is depicted as coming on a shield as a boat, it was that small.
Yeah, then of
I
course
said
it's tiny
skiff specifically. Because Scaefa sounds like Scaefa and skiff, they sound similar.
You wanted to confuse people a bit more.
I just wanted to throw in that extra feel of derivation.
Yeah, sure.
And there's also, I think, I picture him as a coracle more than anything.
Yeah.
A little coracle.
I think when I read it, I did see that. And then when you were telling the story, I must have imagined it as bigger.
Well, certainly he goes off on this huge golden boat. Then he's a big old man by then, so, you know.
Yeah. He needs a bit more space.
But there is something... Also, the bigger a boat is, the more clear who has made it or whatever. So you bring all these other elements. Whereas something I think quite beautiful, but a very small ship that's just designed for the baby, the blades, and the sheaf of corn. Yeah, strange and interesting. A simple hewn boat.
But so he's coming in to land off a world of a water world of sorts, a flood essentially. So
the Great Flood.
You mentioned Noah in the podcast.
Yes.
How can you explain the Noah stuff again?
So I mentioned that the Anglo-Saxons really love the flood story.
Yeah.
That becomes a really major one of the great. So bear in mind, this is long before there's been a complete English translation of the Bible.
Yes.
So there are certain stories that are very well known and very well loved. One of the major ones for the Anglo-Saxons is the story of Noah and the flood. Mm-hmm. I think that probably plays its part in how the king's lists are then used. As I said, a lot of the king's lists are being used for political ends. They always have been to some degree. In earlier times, they connected everyone to Woden, who ever since pagan times was very important, had to be proven as the progenitor of a person or a family in order for them to be elected or appointed to king.
You've got to have the divine lineage.
Yeah, you've got to have that. And even when they euhemerize and remove euhemerizing is when a god is sort of converted to a human being. And they say, oh, well, this person was a great hero, and over the generations, these primitives have elevated him to the status of a god, but he was but a man. That's the process of euhemerization. And as a general rule, it is used far more often as a way of making genuinely pagan traditions acceptable in a Christian context than it is historically an actual explanation for where pagan gods come from. Okay, so generally speaking, it isn't actually that's what happened to this. That's how this person came.
Yeah, very little actual historical.
Yeah, it's more of a
veracity to it,
like a conversion technique.
Yeah,
that more than it is an actual academic theory that holds water. There's always exceptions, so don't flood. Actually, no, do flood me if you have an exception. Send one in, comment, like, hit the bell.
Yeah, disagree with us in the comments.
Yeah.
Much as you like.
Get really angry at us if you like. It's all grist to the mill. So I was talking about this idea of how the kings lists were used. They would give legitimacy to kings, but also they would be used to add even greater lineage. So you would say, remember all those famous heroes of yesteryear? That people would just start throwing them in. Mythic figures, legendary figures, getting all the good ones in. It was very common. Often after Christianization, you would get people going all the way up to Adam. And in fact, that sounds silly, but in the 17th, even in I think as recently as the 18th century, there are English aristocrats who would confabulate pedigrees, taking them all the way back to Adam and Eve, which are obviously ridiculous. But people were doing it as a genuine tool of purely glorification there, but also as a way of attaining status, far lower stakes than actual kingship, though. Yeah. So back with those, you'd got, as I've mentioned earlier, you would have multiple gods in there. Geat, Saxnot, Woden, Sheaf and Shield. We'll come back to Geat, actually, because he's relevant here. You'd also get great figures from history, great legends, and then you would end up it would transition into the biblical stuff quite often. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, it becomes a really elegant way of connecting those traditions and making Scaefa into an acceptable figure in a Christianized world. He simply becomes a fourth son of Noah, an extra biblical fourth son. And I forget which of the Chronicles it is, but it's an early one, or which of the kings list it is. But it specifies that Scaefa was a son of Noah born on the ship. And then in later versions, that name develops and sometimes is Shem or Sheaf. It changes a bit, different spellings and so on. But it very much remains this idea, this back projected idea of Scaefa as being born on Noah's Ark. And then coming from there. Now, some people interpret that...
By some terrible accident gets cast adrift on a lifeboat.
Yeah, I mean... not
really explained.
Well, it isn't explained. And some people some commentators, oddly, academics haven't really engaged with that element. They just say, oh, well, he would have come on a boat because, Noah's Ark's a boat. But it never actually says that. And in fact, all the things do say it remains explicit that he arrives on a boat alone without anyone else.
Noah is not, and lots of animals are not on that boat.
Certainly aren't Noah animals or siblings or anything. No, it's just this baby. So yeah, he was clearly. I don't know how that happened. I don't want to get into the dark family secrets of Noah.
Give him some corn and some swords, and
maybe his wife. Maybe she'd had one last hurrah with the neighbour before the flood came.
Oh dear. And well, then that would mess up the lineage.
Yeah, that would, Noah. Wouldn't it? Oh my God, scandal! Maybe this is the thumbnail. Noah's bastard son? ? The real father of Noah's son. Yeah, Noah's wife, adulterer. Okay, cool. We'll get on that. We'll think about that. Okay, if leave a comment, click like. Disagree.
If you agree with that, that
agree
theory,
with our wild theory, the theory that they don't want you to hear. So what's cool about that is, again, this kind of keeps it going, but it also demonstrates that there was a real will to keep this story, to keep this legend, to keep this myth alive.
Yeah, to keep it legitimate
in a Christianized age when there is an active impulse to obliterate pre-Christian stories and myths.
This is one they want to save.
They make a conscious decision to save this. Yeah, that's interesting. That's really telling. And I'm very grateful for it because that certainly then keeps it through. It's also a fun image of just like the secret baby being a little whittle a small boat and toss him off. Steady. This brings us quite elegantly, I think. That tradition brings us to the song.
Oh, yes.
The wonderful song. I hope you enjoyed that. I was really happy with this song because what we've done with this, essentially, the episode of the podcast, this episode 3, really encapsulates what I want us to be doing with this project. In terms, we talk about creating folk artifacts rather than simply commenting on them.
Engaging with the material in an active,
constructive, active, participatory sense.
Yeah, but not plastering over, but like getting your hands dirty in the actual material.
Absolutely, and that's very much what we're doing. But also, but like continuing the tradition, being a part of the tradition, constructing, making art, subcreating.
Cutting open its belly with your sax knife. And
its knees buckle, and then we want to take the story, we want to place it on a boat of gold with weaponry around it and a sheaf of corn beneath its head. We want to push it out to sea, and watch it go. That's what we want to do. And the way we're doing that, the way we've done that in this episode, we start with my retelling of this story. Then we finish with an excerpt from Tolkien's poetic engagement with this story,
which is now you've described it to me, that seems like such an important step in the process. Tolkien is, after having read Tom Shippey's book Road to Middle Earth,
it's really
it reveals how important a guy Tolkien was.
He was we should do a deep dive just about the Road to Middle Earth at one point.
I have to read the whole thing again.
Oh no! It took you a long time to read.
I read really slowly.
Well, I'm sure there's an audio book you can listen. I'll read it to you. I'll read to you, James. And so we've got the retelling, and then we've got Tolkien's poem, and then in the middle we've got this song. We've got this shanty, which is lovely. So we've got this package of 3 new artistic engagements and interpretations of and with this story together, alongside the talk about it. But really, I think that's very powerful. This song we talked about it in the podcast itself. Specifically, the way that we approached this was by kind of taking the precedent of the Anglo-Saxon back engineering of Scaefa and Scyld into the Noah's Ark story. That precedent means that we are working within that tradition. We are continuing and working within the established English tradition of Scaefa and Scyld, by then
associating it with Noah.
Yeah. By continuing that association, and almost it isn't reversing, but it's like making it a cycle. It's making it a cycle. So the cycle then of them being attached to Noah, and then it comes back around. So then they become the dominant, and they overcome Noah. So like this is part of that cycle of story there. So to do this, as I mentioned in the podcast, I found genuinely a really good shanty. It's like a really good shanty.
It is really good. So actually, just as a side note, when we recorded the Portsmouth Shantymen, we recorded the song that is on the podcast a long time ago. But then just at the end, one for fun, we got them to do the version as they knew it.
Yeah, the original version as they knew it.
The one about Noah.
Yeah.
Which
was great.
Really
Genuinely a really good,
lot of
fun shanty. That exists in a couple of forms. So the title of this shanty is either a long time ago, or a long time, or a very long time ago, or it's something called In Frisco Bay.
In Frisco Bay, yeah.
Because the American version of the song begins with the line In Frisco Bay.
Yeah.
In the original version, begins with the line In Portsmouth Town.
Yeah, that's right. I think when they sang it,
they sang in Portsmouth Bay. But they sing in Portsmouth Bay.
We talked about that with them.
But also that's fine. So the jump back a bit. The song being about Noah and about Noah's Ark means, and also being the recurrent line is a long time and a very long time, a long time ago. That of course is so appropriate because that's literally how this story begins. If you look in Beowulf, if you look at all the versions of it, it emphasizes how long ago this happened. So this idea that the whole thing is a long time ago, that's the nature of the Scaefa and Scyld story. Combining it then with this Noah tradition by taking that framework and telling it through that is perfect. And what I did was, as I said, the lines themselves are translations from the Beowulf section of the story, from the Beowulf telling of the story. I've taken them out loose translations, which are obviously designed to fit with the structure and rhythm and verse and rhyme of the shanty.
Yeah, that was really nice hearing the Tom Shippey translation of Beowulf there. I was like, those are the lines from the song.
Yeah, there's a couple of lines.
I can see that they're translated differently.
To him in child, to him in time a child was born.
Entered the benches of many mead halls.
They all proclaimed that was a good king. Yeah. They're all there. It's really cool. It's literally
straight out of Beowulf.
It's straight out of Beowulf. That's the name of the album. That's the name of our album. Straight out of Beowulf. So we've done... That's great. A tattoo. Straight out of Beowulf. Brilliant. Oh. So we've by doing that, I think that's exactly the kind of artistic exploration of these traditions, which isn't about inverting or subverting, and it isn't about deconstructing, and it isn't about appropriating or exploiting for some other. It's genuinely really engaging with the richness and the denseness, but working with the tradition rather than against the tradition. Developing and continuing it rather than choking it off or cutting it off or starting anew or somehow twisting it artificially. The developments are all established as appropriate developments within that continuity. I loved it. And obviously, the Portsmouth Shantymen were chosen, as we said in the podcast, because the earliest version, which says in Portsmouth Town, was recorded at the Portsmouth Workhouse. A workhouse, for any who don't know, was in the 19th century a place. Instead of there being any real welfare system, workhouses existed, and the very, very, very poor. It was essentially like hard labor, and they were paid a stipend, a small amount of money, and they were given room and board and pretty meager meals, and lived in pretty rotten conditions, and just worked, horrible labor all day, every day, but were given somewhere to sleep and live. And it wasn't nice stuff.
No, not a great place to be.
Wasn't a good thing. That was not good kinning. Bad kinning. But it being from there, obviously, we then concluded or completed or worked within that by getting the Portsmouth Shantymen. So if anyone owns the tradition of Portsmouth shanties, it is them. They've been doing it for near on 50 years now, which is, again, great continuity. They, as we said, 3 of the 4 people who were singing have actually worked on the tall ships, which is really cool. Like, they are actual seamen and have that knowledge and have been doing so for a long time. That the knowledge they have, that really informs the way they perform, I think. Taking all of that, and so bearing in mind that we've got these actual sailors that are actually singing this song, which was once about Noah, but is now about Scaefa and Scyld, which is all about a long time ago, all about the sea voyage. It's all there, and it's from Portsmouth, the place where that song was first recorded. So I think that is, and the words they're using are like 1400 years old. It's, for me, that song is really the apotheosis. What we did, our version of this song, that recording, this production, that is the apotheosis of our project. That's so much of what we're trying to do in terms of combining and connecting these elements and twisting it together as a sailor twists rope to create something stronger and more usable and something different, but it's still made up of all the same things. But it's functional. It's functional, and
like
it's functional.
like Tolkien's tower.
Like Tolkien's tower, which we won't describe again because we've already talked about that. It's in the podcast. It's also in Tom Shippey's book, The Road to Middle Earth. Very good book. That is good kinning. I think that we've achieved that. We, and when I say we, I mean you and I, and also the Portsmouth Shantymen, who were bloody marvellous. Lovely fellas. It was a really lovely day when we went and recorded them. That was so much fun.
It's nice to have multiple musicians to record all at once. I don't know. It was just it felt like a bit more of a production.
I mean, this whole project, a really nice element of it has been going around and recording the musicians in different places, different backgrounds. It's been a really positive experience. So with this episode in particular, we've I don't want to say we've created, but we have continued this. So we've got a song, we've got a poem, we've got the story. We've taken all these elements of this tradition, and I very much feel that we have successfully continued this tradition. The tradition of this story, this ancient legend, which has for millennia been a part of English culture and has been a significant part of it, developing alongside it for the best part of 1,000 years. I think we've done a really good job of reincorporating that.
The elements involved and the way we've dealt with it, it feels quite comprehensive, quite kind of, like we've really dug in. Yeah,
I hope so. I really hope so. And I mean, there's other elements in this. The music, actually, as we're on the subject of this music, is really interesting. The music, I mentioned earlier, Geat. I said we'd come back to Geat.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So the reason that I mentioned Geat, and this is in my Anglo-Saxon myths book. There's a further bit of the Sheaf and Shield story where I talk about Geat and Matilde. I won't go into too much detail on that one, but there are certain references in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. It's a more fully realized tale in the Scandinavian. But that's specifically about Geat, who's always in these kings' lists as a descendant then of Scaefa, usually coming a bit later. But Geat was a god once upon a time, the ancestor god of the Geats, in fact, just as Saxonot was the ancestor god of the Saxons. Yeah, makes sense, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. This is slightly irrelevant, but I was recognizing the name Saxonot from the excavation of
from Hobbs Barrow. Yeah, that's cool, isn't it? We'll definitely do a deep dive on Hobbs Barrow. Hobbs Barrow. What's it called? It's not called Hobbs. The excavation of Hobbs Barrow. Yeah, it's really good. I want to do it again. It's a brilliant.
It's a point and click adventure game.
So good. Came out this year, I think. This year, maybe last year.
Well, I don't know. I only just played it because you told me about it recently.
Yeah. It might be it came out within the last couple of years. It's an old school pixel art, LucasArts style point and click adventure game. If that's your thing, it's my thing. It's exactly my thing. And it's very much a folk horror one. And it engages with so much cool English folk horror and folk culture stuff. It's great. We will do a proper deep dive. We could probably also maybe try to get an interview with
be lovely to
behind it. I can't believe that would be impossible.
Could be possible.
Yeah. I'm sure. I would hope so. Anyway. No promises. We will definitely do a deep dive on that at some point. Then maybe only for paid subscribers. I don't know. So on the music front,
we'll see.
On the music front, the Geat story, which I'm not going to go into detail of now, by the book, it very much makes this idea of playing a harp explicit, and this idea of music, and kind of this almost Orpheus and Eurydice style thing of playing the harp to revive to bring your love back from death, back from the clutches of death.
Oh yeah.
In some versions it's successful, in some versions not. She's drowned, and sometimes she's brought back from the water alive, sometimes she's brought back but she's still dead. And it's very much about this idea of the musical instruments. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of bring that Geat thing, because Geat is always in these kings lists a descendant of this line. I wanted to bring in that little fragment of a Geat story, and then I tied that harp in with the harp of the Sceafings, as I call them, and as I did it in this telling, that demonstrated the decline of this kingly line, and it all goes to hell, and then he's sent off. Geat is then sent off by his people, just as all the previous ones were, and a sword of sacrifice, and then a new baby arrives, and then it's all nice again. And so we see again this cycle, the cycle coming and going and coming and going again and again and again. I felt very much that was appropriate, bearing in mind Tolkien's development. Throughout all this stuff, I'm really conscious of acknowledging that Tolkien is not just some guy writing fantasy stories. Tolkien, when he writes and engages with this stuff, is continuing the traditions, and you would have to be the height of arrogance to disregard or reject Tolkien's stuff.
Yeah,
on this.
I mean, isn't it arguable that he was not ever writing fantasy?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is very much arguable. We'll say that for another video, but it's absolutely arguable, and it's correct. I often put it like this: before Tolkien's work, the average person didn't know. If you talk about dwarves or elves, the average person did not picture what they now picture. The average person, when they think of firstly, they wouldn't really have thought of dwarves as being anything other than a short human. And elves, they would have thought of as like pixies, like fairy type things, like to do with Father Christmas. Tolkien reseeded so many concepts back into the consciousness, the Anglophone consciousness, in a really organic way. And I quite often say that his project, his desire to restore the English mythology, he says that of course that's couldn't be done. It couldn't be done then because Tolkien was writing before Tolkien had written.
Yeah.
But in a world where Tolkien he's laid the groundwork, the soil is now fertile. He's furrowed the field, ploughed it nicely so that now it can grow. Because when you refer to dwarves or ents or elves, we now have that frame of reference. Organically and naturally and authentically, everybody knows what those things are. And the idea
of really flourished.
The idea of ever not knowing what they are. Yeah, he is a good gardener. He's a very good gardener. Yeah. The idea of anyone not knowing those things or not having that frame of reference is laughable. Everybody does, and it's entirely thanks to Tolkien. And because of that, I can write this book and tell these stories in a way, and people... Anyone with the vaguest of passing interests can pick it up and read it and will be able to engage with it. And we'll push them a bit further.
They have the frame of reference.
But they have the frames of reference. Organically. And that's the key. Authentically and organically. Not in a performative or pretentious or cope way. It's real. And because of that, Tolkien's emphasis on the music. In Tolkien's poem, he arrives with a harp in the boat. In Tolkien's poem, and that's him giving that. In my version, he makes the instrument from these bones he finds. I felt that there's precedent for that as a motif in folktale and in other mythology.
Yeah, certainly. Like there's god figures who create the first harp.
There's no shortage.
Hermes does that.
Yeah, so that element I actually got from English folklore. In the specific thing of that being done, I can't remember where, but there's a bit of a folktale about someone who essentially did that.
Yeah.
Who I combined
invents music.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, and because we spoke in the previous episode about taking this Kalevala approach, and where I'm actively engaging with English folklore because that is part of the English tradition, even if it is coming centuries later. And so I decided to do that here with this, and to combine and engage these elements together. Certainly, that made perfect sense to me. It's taking this element that Tolkien saw and drew out and put in that context. But I've taken that and I've allowed it to be reseeded and defined, not by just mimicking Tolkien, but by synthesizing Tolkien's interpretation with pre-existing folklore. That's a couple of hundred years earlier than Tolkien. And moving that forward. And I think then for me, this idea of art as creation, and if this is a creation myth as it is, I think that this idea of incorporating art and sub-creation is vital, because it's like mirrors against mirrors. Are there any other symbols? Are there any other motifs or elements in this story that you can think of that we've not discussed or explained or gone into?
Well, I mean, I do want to briefly talk about because there's a repeated phrase in many of your stories of the song that began in hello and ended in goodbye, and that I recognise from...
Have I cued you to raise this? Or,
no,
or are you
no.
praying?
It's something that
I'm very glad that you're raising
I
this.
always like it when it pops up. I recognise it from the storyteller.
Do you know what's even cooler?
No.
You're going to love this. You're going to really love this.
Tell me.
So... yeah, I recognise it from The Storyteller, which written by Anthony Minghella. We've referred to Jim Henson's The Storyteller before. Yeah. It's brilliant. Specifically, the initial series starring John Hurt. Yeah. Not so much the later 4-part spin-off starring Michael Gambon, which doesn't have Anthony Minghella involved.
I was also wondering whether John Hurt's character is Widsith.
Maybe,
because he does seem to be
maybe
long-lived, and he pops up inside some of the stories.
There's a few. Maybe I like that. That's There's if Batsford are willing to publish Anglo-Saxon myths too, then the kind of through line of that is these long-lived storytellers.
So write a letter to
Batsford. An angry letter. Demand. Written by Anthony Minghella, this first one. He comes up with this beautiful line, a song that began in ho and ended in goodbye.
And often he says in between something.
Yeah, I usually riff on that, but I use a lot because I think it's beautiful. And as I said previously, I literally grew up with The Storyteller, and that was one of my key, as a child, one of my key formative experiences of art and story, and certainly of storytelling, was this version of it. So that it's not only a beautiful phrase, but it ties in with so much that I've already engaged with. As we have also already mentioned, Anthony Minghella was from the Isle of Wight, which is just down the way from here. And in fact, it's
famously of Minghella ice cream.
Famously of the Minghella ice cream family. His family are famous around here, not because their son was Anthony Minghella, but because of their ice cream vans on the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight and the New Forest, the Uten, were the Witwar and the Uten, yet in I suppose, were Jutes. They were this Jutish kingdom, essentially. Either two separate kingdoms or the same, whatever. Little island just off the New Forest is the Isle of Wight. We were this tiny chunk of Jutes within the vast swathe of West Saxons, with Kent being the other area of Jutes. And interestingly, the Isle of Wight, I don't think we tell the story this season, but maybe next. The Isle of Wight was the last English pagan king which was who was Arwald of the Isle of Wight, and that was only in I think the very late 680 something, right at the end of the 600s was when he was killed. The story is in here, but it's also in here, and in a slightly larger form in there because it's local here and there. I won't go into that. But what's really cool about that is I heard an old man in the Isle of Wight use that phrase. And really? I asked him about it, and he just said, it's old. It's just old. He's always said it.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Lovely. I'm really happy.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
I don't see...
Why wouldn't it?
That there's no reason that's really better than it being a Mangala thing, but it feels... Yeah, more like
it's some local roots. Turn of phrase. So that lovely little phrase is, and that isn't the reason I started using it in my storytelling. I started using it because it's a beautiful phrase, and I love it. But yeah, this must have been about 15 years ago. An old man, I don't know, early 80s maybe, and he just said, I've always said that. It's just what's what people say.
Great.
Yeah, isn't that great? So that is a genuine flourish of storytelling. But here's the madness. If it hadn't have been used by Anthony Minghella and the storyteller, it may well have just been lost. And people may have stopped using it. Maybe that old man was the last person who would have used it otherwise. And when he died, he's probably dead now. Hope he's not. If you're listening, leave a comment. Old man in a pub in the Isle of Wight. Yeah. But that survives thanks to Anthony Minghella's beautiful writing of Jim Henson's The Storyteller. And now,
wonderful,
because I've heard that, I use that. And now people hear this, and hopefully they will then use that.
I'm probably going to use it at some point.
It's gorgeous. I use it in a lot of my tellings things. It's such a nice turn of phrase.
Yeah, the fact of it having a lineage like that really makes it appealing to use. Like it makes it feel like
continuity.
It's free to use.
Absolutely, and it's free to use, but it also really emphasizes this, and this is what we talk about with Jim Henson, the storyteller, a lot, this idea of continuity. It doesn't feel just like, this is a thing Jim Henson made. It feels so much greater and wider than that, and it is. I know for a fact that the consultants they got were storytellers working in the 70s storytelling revival. The puppeteers they got were people who had worked on Labyrinth, who'd done Punch and Judy, who'd done loads of different things. The physical theatre performers who were involved in it were people from a lot of the actors too. The writer was Anthony Minghella. So much stuff combines. Again, we have this matted hair of folk, all these, and which really the matted hair of folk is just a horrible, grim way of describing what culture should be. It's just cultural continuity. And I don't mean mass cult. I think the trouble is a lot of, really, perhaps we can look at folk culture as distinct to mass culture or corporatized culture.
Yeah, globalized
culture, commercialized culture, which of course, the thing is, globalized culture is by definition commercialized culture because it can't naturally be. The only way it can be global is if it exists within an explicitly commercialized framework. You can't organically just be global.
Produced by organizations and packaged hermetically.
Or they're put online, but then they're exploited by the algorithm, and various different companies and brands boost it, and they use it. Yeah,
capitalist motivation.
By definition, this is and that is anti-folk. Yeah. When it's like that, that is explicitly anti-folk. So the issue is not inherently that it's globalist, perhaps, but more that globalism, by definition, is commercial. Yeah, it's commercialism. It has to be. If you disagree, leave a comment. Explain to us why we're wrong. I hope we are.
Is there any more on begins with hello and ends in goodbye? I think I just wanted to flag it up as a nice phrase.
It's a beautiful phrase.
I also so we talked about the three key kings going Scaefa, Scyld, Beowa. What about Scaefa's wife? What's her deal?
What's her deal?
The finest maid.
The finest. So the Scaefa's wife bit is kind of good catch. That is a reference to fertility rites of Indo-European fertility rites, which we still
a few
have.
things from him, doesn't it? She demands a cart and lovely horses.
Taken around in procession. So that's a reference to the traces that we've got of fertility rites that were probably pertaining to one of the fertility goddesses or one of the land goddesses in Anglo-Saxon England, perhaps Urca, who is referenced in the next episode, the song in the next episode. So we won't go too much into Urca. So in fact, we actually. Oh, I tell you what, I will briefly go into that, but this is going to be directly relevant to the next episode.
Oh, join us for the next
episode. So I will just say that is a reference to agricultural rites around female, around sort of fertility goddesses, goddesses of the field. For more on that, stay tuned. Well, don't stay tuned, just wait a couple of weeks or so. Our next episode 4, here's a good teaser opportunity, will be the Urith sacrifice. And that will be another story from here, but it will be in a very different form to the version that's in here.
Very different, not entirely different.
Not entirely different, but very different. And we'll explain everything about that in the next episode. But it is, interestingly, it will unite a lot of the threads of the first 3 episodes. It will mat a lot of those hairs together. We have agriculture, we have sacrifice, we even have scarlet pimpernels. We have loads of stuff. Everything we've spoken of in these first 3 will combine in this 4th episode, which is probably the most obscure story of this first chunk of 4. I realize actually that the way we've structured this is that we've got our episodes divide quite neatly into 3 sections of 4. The first 4 are harvest essentially, and the next 4 are essentially Halloween, All Hallows, All Souls, and then the final 4 are all Yuletide. And the final 5 really, because we've got Christmas is a special separate episode.
Okay.
So we've got 12 episodes, and then with the Christmas special is this other one. So we've got the final 5 are Yuletide, and the first 4 are Harvest, and the middle 4 are All Hallows. And they divide very elegantly thematically, not intentional. Not intentional. It was simply, it was divine. It was divine. It was godly.
Well, we did intentionally line them up with time of year.
Yeah, we did, but then orders have changed and shifted. And it's been in terms of them working as very nice quads, which I think this first 4. I mean, maybe this won't be the case as we continue, but I think this first 4 work very nicely alongside each other because we've spoken before about the diversity and the breadth of the tradition that is demonstrated by them because they're very different.
Yeah.
But also they do overlap in very interesting ways that wouldn't be obvious. And I think this 4th one will really unlock that and demonstrate the degree to which they do all connect nicely. Well, we've already spoken about how Puck from Sprack Jack directly connects to all this stuff.
Yeah.
How Puck connect, how etymologically Puck and Barleycorn, Puck and Beowa are kind of somehow at some bizarre move, maybe even the same figure, which is bizarre. We didn't go into that, but in terms of this idea of Barleycorn and Beowa being part of the cultural consciousness, that's significant. That the word Puck in English dialect means sheaf of corn.
Yeah.
So we have Puck as Beowa. We explained this fun derivation, this fun weird comparative relationship between Finnish and Old Norse words for barleycorn and Beowa, how that Beowa becomes big and bigvir in the Old Norse, meaning grain, and a minor god of the field, who interestingly is associated with Freyr, fertility god. We already mentioned in terms of the Vanir and this idea of the two sides, the warriors and the fertility gods. So he's connected there, and then in the Finnish tradition, that's also then connected to Bigvir, is connected to Pukka, which is the this spirit of the barley in the fields, and that is then, it sounds like Puck already, and the word Puck in English dialect, certainly in the New Forest, and I think in other regional dialects, means a sheaf of corn.
So we already talked about how Pukka, like that the word exists in both Old English and and Irish.
And so there we have this idea of the barley figure also being the sheaf of corn figure, the sheaf figure, the Sceafa and the barley figure. So that's all the agricultural stuff, and explicitly connected with the fertility god Freyr in the Norse tradition. So I mean, and obviously we are. I only use comparative mythology in a very careful sense because I would rather overcorrect in terms of not using it than I would fall prey to
away
and
link
overwhelm.
Things.
And I'm also more interested. I'm more interested in what has survived in the English tradition.
Yeah.
Because what has survived is part of the English culture. Stuff that hasn't survived, I kind of feel like that is part of the process by which it is no longer part of that story, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, if it's gone
forever,
we might.
If it's gone, then don't take it from another culture and fill in the gap.
It shouldn't be transplanted.
Explore why there is a gap and explore what that might mean. Like just as with this story of Scaefa and Scyld, we've embraced this cyclical thing. You could have so easily just filled in gaps by taking stuff. I would much rather use later English folklore to fill in a gap, though I don't really think that's a good way of putting it, but for sake of argument, I would much rather use the later English folklore to fill in a gap than I would stuff from the same period that's about the same thing, but from the Norse, for example.
Yeah.
Much rather. Because that is this cultural continuity. That's what's so important. This tradition. That's what this whole thing is about. But the idea that we've got, and in this instance, I think it's really worth acknowledging this connection, this explicit connection between these sheaf characters, these agricultural characters, and that fertility, especially when it comes back to what has already been said about Scaefa and Scyld being the Vanir and the Aesir, and the Scaefa character being them that synthesized. So that's really interesting because this also ties back in with what we were saying about John Barleycorn somehow being an example of this idea of the personified but also sacrificed figure of the barley remaining alive in the folk consciousness. Even in a very vague, broad semiotic sense rather than a specific parallel sense. And of course, Puck survived that entire period. Puck exists at the time that they are writing the King's Roll in the 15th century and remains alive throughout that period up into the establishment of the John Barleycorn figure. So that really then never goes away. That idea of this personified sheaf of corn, that's powerful. That does survive, and it's amorphous and weird and impossible to delineate clearly and say this means that means that means this.
Yeah, I mean these are imaginary figures. They are not actual people. It's a set of qualities that are echoing through
it's this
history.
like public. It is this folk consciousness remaining, the continuity of it remaining alive and constant, right up to the present day and far beyond. One would hope. Well, certainly now we've done this episode, it'll be around for it forever. So we're fine. We've saved it.
YouTube will be there forever.
I mean, the fact we're on YouTube, it means that you'll get it. This is commercialized culture even now. I mean, so we should acknowledge at least that by making this, we are in some way contributing to globalized culture and thus to commercialized culture.
I'm certainly financially motivated in this project.
Yes. Oh, yes. This is all about the bucks. This is all about the deep pockets we now have. We're so wealthy now, aren't we? We're making so much money. Oh, gosh. I'm surprised. I did not think we'd make as much as we have so quickly. The wife, the mother of Scyld, that was a good thing. We'll come back to that next episode. Anything else?
I mean, if we're talking about the other peripheral characters, you've also got Woden himself. / the hooded
grim and hooded man with the mad gaze.
But I think once we establish that is Woden, I'm not sure how much more there is to say about him. We were talking about him in the
as we said
list,
in the podcast. So he exists in the King's List, which is one of the motivators. Even though he's often put further down than Scaefa, I think that's because he's explicitly euhemerized, and that's not appropriate.
Yeah.
We talked in the podcast about this idea of Woden creating idols and that element, which, again, you have to get a little bit comparative there, but it does make sense of a lot of the sources. I think when the comparative stuff is done very subtly and it actively makes sense of the surviving things that are within the English tradition, that's fine. It's when there's no surviving thing, and so you just take it wholesale. It has to simply, I think if you use comparative mythology as a key to unlock the sources that have survived in the English tradition, that's appropriate. When you use it to replace sources or to add sources, that's not appropriate.
Or to make the English tradition
into the Norse,
the same as the Norse tradition,
which is totally wrong.
That would be obliterating a
and actually, Scaefa and Scyld is a perfect example of this, because you have such a clear Danish and Icelandic tradition, but which those do not only should one not try to synthesize them, but those are totally separate traditions which develop over a millennium in other countries with other cultures and other peoples. And even if they do have the same initial root, they are two totally different trees. It's just the same spinny, but these are different trees. And to try and tie them all together and treat them as one, all you do then is lose all three of them, frankly. You end up killing it off. And I think that the very fact, as we said, that it has survived for so long in each of these cultures, especially in the English tradition, means you don't destroy that. Don't actively try and destroy. I mean, to be honest, I think it would I don't think it would end up destroying it in any broader sense. It would simply not work. It wouldn't root itself. It would be forgotten.
It would be
moved on
failure at continuity.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be failed continuity. So the Woden stuff, and again, the unnamed Woden character, or the unnamed Odinic figure, that's a classic trope, a classic motif in Germanic stuff. And if you want more on that, I would recommend Heathen Gods in Old English Literature.
This one here.
By North. Yeah, don't pull it out because it'll knock down
Everything
the thing.
will fall over.
But yeah, that's a very good book. We'll put that source down somewhere. That talks at length about this figure existing in the English tradition. There's no shortage of examples in the Scandinavian tradition of this Odinic figure. Unnamed, but clearly intentionally being acknowledged as Odin in disguise, as we mentioned in the podcast. Yeah, are there any other figures, characters in this?
I think we've covered.
I think we've covered everything.
The whole thing. Yeah.
I think we've covered all the elements that we aren't going to then cover in a later episode.
Yeah.
So I suppose I would again do. Comment if you've enjoyed this, say as much. If you haven't enjoyed this, say as much. At this stage, the project really is nice and reactive and flexible, and we hope that you have enjoyed the first 3 episodes and the first 3 deep dives of Finding Folklore.
Yeah.
Subscribe, hit the
bell,
hit
comment,
the bell.
Tell your friends,
tell your enemies, tell those about whom you have no strong opinion.
And join us again for episode 4, Urith.
Yes, episode 4, the Urith sacrifice. Just as we began in hello, let us end, James, in goodbye.
Goodbye!
Goodbye!